The sky was a relentless grey, a heavy dome pressing down on the cracked earth. I could feel its weight even through the thin fabric of my dress. My wrists burned from the rope that had been tied so tightly around them that the skin had begun to peel, and my legs ached from the awkward stance forced upon me by the fence post. But it wasn't the rope that cut into me most. It was the hollow eyes of my children, staring at me as if I could conjure bread from the dry wind. They were smaller than I remembered, their ribs sharp beneath clothes that hung like paper from their frail frames. The land around us was a wasteland of dust and dry grass, stretching endlessly with no promise of mercy. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the faint creak of wagon wheels and the clatter of hooves sounded like a cruel reminder that the world had moved on without us. My husband's kinfolk lounged near their wagon, faces twisted in satisfaction as if the sight of our suffering was a feast. They muttered, sharp voices carrying on the wind, calculating which one of us might vanish easiest. I whispered to the children, pressing my lips close to the crown of my eldest son's hair, my voice cracking with desperation. Hold on. Just hold on. But the wind took my words and flung them into the dust. No one heard me. No one cared. Hunger had sharpened hearts to cruelty, and mine had become a quiet battlefield. I prayed to a God who had long since abandoned this field, begged for salvation that never came. And yet, even in that endless grey, there was movement. The soft echo of hooves at first, far off, steady, deliberate, then closer, deliberate, like the rhythm of judgment itself. I squinted into the distance, heart hammering, unsure if it was hope or another shadow meant to mock us. A man appeared over the hill, riding a horse that snorted through the dust like it had carried sorrow all its life. Even from afar, he was impossible to ignore. Broad shoulders beneath a dark coat, his hat low over a face shaped by loss and silence. He slowed as he neared us, pulling the horse into a gentle halt a few yards away. The dust swirled, the wind tugging at his coat, and I saw the lines of his face, sharp as a knife. His eyes scanned us, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet certainty I had never known. The children shrank behind me, instinctively sensing that this man was not like the others. My in-laws barked their usual threats, voices dripping with disdain. "Best ride on, stranger," one said, his hand twitching near his knife. "Ain't your business what we do here." But the man didn't speak. He just studied us. And then, without a word, he drew close, and in a single, fluid motion, he cut the ropes that bound me. The cords fell to the earth, slack and harmless, and I stumbled forward, weak and trembling. He caught me by the elbow, steadying me, his touch firm, reassuring, and utterly without judgment. The children clung to me, faces pressed to my skirts, and I realized I was shaking, not from cold, not from hunger, but from a sudden, fragile hope. The man ignored the curses flying from my in-laws, lifting the smallest child into his arms, signaling the others to follow. He guided me toward his horse, his movements careful, deliberate, like he was protecting more than just flesh and bone. I climbed onto the saddle, half carried, half leaning against him, the children following close. The wind tugged at my hair and dress, but I felt anchored by his presence, a quiet shield against the cruelty I had known all my life. And in that moment, as the dust of the plains rose behind us, I realized something I had not dared feel in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, survival did not have to be a solitary struggle. We rode in silence toward what I could only imagine as safety. The man's horse moved with a steady cadence of inevitability, and though my body ached, I dared to let my mind drift to the possibility of a home, of warmth, of bread. I dared to imagine a place where my children could laugh instead of whimper, where I could stand without fear of scorn. The horizon stretched endlessly before us, the plains stark and unyielding, but for the first time since this nightmare began, the horizon seemed not a wall, but a path. And I clung to that path as if my very life depended on it. Because in a world that had offered nothing but hunger and cruelty, this man, this stranger, had given me the smallest, most powerful gift of all, a chance to rise again. The path ahead was a thin ribbon of dust and stone, winding through the plains that stretched endlessly in every direction. The wind carried a bitter tang of parched earth and dry grass, filling my lungs with each ragged inhale. My children clung to me, weak, pale, and trembling, not just from hunger, but from the terror that had been their constant companion these past days. Their small fingers sought mine, desperate for reassurance that I could not fully give. Even in the saddle, their knees knocked against mine, and my own legs ached with every sway of the horse beneath us. Yet still, I dared to breathe, to imagine a place where the gnawing emptiness inside our stomachs could finally be filled. The man behind me, Richard, remained silent. His presence was a wall against the world, a barrier of calm strength that made it almost impossible for the cruelty behind us to reach my children. I could feel the tension in his shoulders, the slow, deliberate movements that spoke of a life hardened by loss and solitude. There was no warmth in his expression, at least not in the way a kind word might convey it. Yet there was an understanding deeper than language, an awareness that we were not just bodies in need of bread, but lives that had been battered by circumstance and cruelty. The children murmured occasionally, voices soft and trembling. My eldest, a boy of no more than 10, tried to steady his siblings with whispered instructions and protective gestures that belied his years. I could see the strain in his face, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a stone. The youngest, no more than 3, nestled against my chest, eyes wide and uncomprehending, yet somehow trusting the strange man who carried them. Trust was a fragile thing, and in that barren landscape, it had been nearly impossible to find. But something in Richard's silent command, in the deliberate rhythm of his horse, suggested a world where trust could grow again. The plains stretched on endlessly, punctuated by the occasional gnarled tree or distant hill, but the horizon held the promise of something different. A haven, perhaps, or at least a pause from the relentless cruelty that had stalked us. My mind wandered to the small gestures that had sustained us, the secret ration of crumbs I had tucked away for my children, the whispered lullabies under the moonlight, the small prayers I offered to a God whose silence was almost as cruel as my in-laws' greed. And now, riding toward a destination I could not yet see, I allowed myself the smallest flicker of hope. Richard did not speak, but his eyes occasionally flicked to the children, lingering with a kind of scrutiny that was neither judgmental nor dismissive. It was as if he were memorizing their shapes, the curve of their cheeks, the uneven line of their hair, preparing himself for the weight of responsibility that came with sheltering them. There was something almost ritualistic in his care, the careful way he adjusted the reins, the subtle nudges he gave the horse to maintain steady pace, the way he ensured that none of us jostled too harshly in the saddle. Even without words, he taught the children to follow, to remain close, to survive. The wind grew harsher as the afternoon pressed on, gusting across the plains with an almost vindictive force. Dust stung our eyes, and the sun, low and unrelenting, baked the exposed skin of our arms and faces. I wiped a smear of sweat and dirt from my forehead and pressed the children closer, shielding them as best I could. Hunger gnawed at us like a living thing, a persistent ache that reminded me with every step that our survival was not guaranteed. Yet for all its cruelty, there was an odd comfort in the rhythm of our journey, the steady cadence of hooves on hard soil, the quiet determination of the man guiding us. At one point, the eldest whispered my name, fear threading through the syllable. I looked down to see tears streaked across his dust-smeared face, and my own throat tightened. I wanted to promise him that everything would be all right, but the truth was, I could not know. All I could do was hold on to him, let my heart beat with his, and trust that Richard's silent resolve would carry us through. And somehow, in the midst of my fear, I felt a small, fragile sense of safety, a tether to a world where perhaps cruelty could be outmatched by quiet courage. By late afternoon, the outline of the ranch began to emerge against the horizon. Weathered wood and low, sturdy buildings rose from the plain like a promise etched into the earth itself. There was no grandeur, no sign of wealth, but the sight of solid walls and roofs intact enough to ward off the wind struck something deep within me. Relief pressed against my chest, thick and heavy, and I felt the tension of the journey ease, even if only slightly. The children stirred, sensing the proximity of shelter, and I felt my own body relax enough to breathe without counting the pain in each limb. Richard guided us toward a wide gate, the slow clatter of hooves on the wooden posts echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. I dismounted, weak legs trembling under me, and watched as he lifted the smallest child with effortless care. One by one, they followed, guided by his presence, until we stood within the yard, a fragile family tethered together by circumstance and courage. The dust settled around us, but the air was thick with anticipation, with the unspoken question of what would come next. And in that moment, as the sun dipped toward the horizon and the ranch loomed before us like a fortress against despair, I allowed myself to hope. Hope that the world could be something other than hunger and cruelty. Hope that a quiet man with no need for words could offer more than protection, perhaps even dignity. My children pressed close, their small bodies trembling, but there was a light in their eyes, a flicker that had been nearly extinguished, now rekindled by the promise of shelter. For the first time in days, I dared to imagine that we might survive, not just the hunger, not just the cruelty, but the very world itself. And in the silent strength of the man who had brought us here, I saw the faintest trace of something more, a world where hope could grow, and where even the smallest, most battered hearts might find refuge. The ranch was quieter than I had ever imagined a place could be. The wind, though still persistent across the plains, seemed to bend around the buildings, muting its usual howl. I dismounted with shaky legs, my children following closely, clutching at my skirts as if they had never felt the touch of safety before. Richard's movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as he helped us down, lifting the smallest child into his arms and gently nudging the others to steady themselves. The first thing I noticed was the smell, earthy, warm, and alive. Unlike the dust-choked plains we had just traversed, the ranch carried a promise of sustenance. With smoke curling from a distant chimney, faint notes of fresh bread, and the faint tang of livestock carried on the breeze. My stomach twisted in hunger, but also in disbelief. For the first time in days, I could imagine a meal not scavenged, not begged for, but prepared with intention and care. Richard guided us inside a sturdy building, its walls worn but solid, the floorboards polished by years of use. I wanted to sink to my knees, but the children clung to me, tiny anchors to the reality that we were still bound together, still responsible for one another. The eldest leaned against my leg, whispering my name, a tremor of fear in his voice that had become all too familiar. I pressed my hand to his hair and murmured words I didn't entirely believe myself, promising that this was different, that we might survive this new place. Inside, the room was simple, yet it radiated warmth. A stove stood in one corner, its surface blackened with use, and a long table stretched across the center, scarred but sturdy. Richard moved with deliberate calm, placing pots and bowls before us without a single word, his silence heavier than any declaration. He worked as though he had done this 100 times before, each gesture precise, efficient, yet careful, acknowledging the fragility of the small lives before him. The children stared, their eyes wide, at the food set before them. The stew, steaming and rich, smelled like hope. They didn't speak, only reached with trembling hands, shoveling the nourishment into their mouths as if the act of eating itself could anchor them back to life. I watched them, my own hands trembling, feeling a mix of shame, relief, and disbelief. This was not charity. It was care, deliberate and steadfast, and I had almost forgotten what that felt like. For a long moment, I simply observed, letting the quiet weight of the room settle over me. Richard did not instruct, did not demand. He merely ensured we had what we needed. And in that silence, there was a kind of instruction too, a lesson that survival was not measured in noise or grand gestures, but in the steadiness of presence, in the constancy of protection, in the quiet honor of caring for those who had been abandoned by the world. After the meal, he directed us toward a corner of the ranch where modest rooms awaited. The children hesitated, unsure if this comfort was real, if the walls would crumble under the weight of the harsh world outside. I led them in, guiding each to a small cot, watching as their exhaustion took hold, and they fell into the deep, untroubled sleep of children who had, for a moment, been allowed safety. I remained awake, kneeling by the hearth, hands busy with mending the tattered clothes we had worn for days. My fingers ached, raw from the rough fabric, but there was a strange peace in the repetition, in the tangible act of restoring what had been torn. Richard watched from the doorway, silent as always, hat in hand, eyes steady and unyielding. In his gaze I felt neither judgment nor pity, only an acknowledgment that we existed, that we deserved to survive, and perhaps, in time, to flourish. Even as the comfort of the ranch enveloped us, I could not ignore the whispers that must already be drifting from the town. The plains were vast, but news travelled faster than the wind. Our sudden disappearance, our appearance at this place, would not go unnoticed. And yet, Richard made no mention of it, no warning, no promises. He simply offered a roof, food, and the unspoken assurance that the world's cruelty could not reach us here, at least not yet. I moved quietly through the ranch, exploring the small rooms, the barns, and the fenced pastures. It was no palace, no glittering estate, but it carried something I had not known I craved: dignity. In the worn wood, in the sturdy doors, in the careful arrangements of necessities, there was a message clear without words. Life could be reclaimed, even from the ashes of despair. Richard followed at a distance, his figure a dark sentinel against the fading light. At times, he would glance at me, eyes steady, unflinching, as if measuring the pace at which I dared to breathe again. I felt the weight of that scrutiny, heavy yet oddly comforting, and I realized that this was a kind of trust, too, the quiet acknowledgement that he had chosen to bind himself to our lives, despite what the world might say. Night fell with a gentle finality, rain pattering softly against the roof, washing the dust of the plains from our skins, if not entirely from our hearts. I watched the children sleep, small breaths rising and falling in unison, and for the first time I allowed myself to imagine a future not dictated by scarcity, fear, and cruelty, but by steady care, quiet resilience, and the possibility of safety. And in the stillness, I understood that survival was more than filling empty stomachs. It was about the reclamation of dignity, the subtle return of trust, and the fragile, almost imperceptible beginnings of hope. For the first time since the rope had cut into my wrists and the wind had carried my despair across the plains, I allowed myself to feel something more than fear. I allowed myself to believe that perhaps, in this place, we could endure, and perhaps even thrive. The mornings at the ranch were a quiet rhythm, one I had never known but quickly came to rely upon. Sunlight poured across the wooden floorboards, weak but insistent, seeping into the corners of our small rooms and chasing away the lingering shadows of the plains. The children stirred with the light, eyes blinking against the glow, and I moved among them with careful hands, helping them dress, comb hair, and tie laces. For the first time in weeks, their movements weren't frantic, aren't trembling with hunger or fear. They were deliberate, even if slow, and I marveled at the small miracle of their recovery. Richard remained a silent presence, always nearby but never intrusive. He worked with a steady, deliberate pace, mending fences, tending to animals, preparing the day's tasks. I watched him, often from the kitchen doorway, noting the small ways he cared without speaking. A bowl set down just out of reach, so that I could place it carefully before a child. A gentle nudge of a horse to prevent a stumble. A steadying hand when a child wobbled on the uneven ground. No words, but everything measured, precise, almost ritualistic in its constancy. Our meals were still simple, but they were real. Stews simmered on the stove, bread baked in small loaves, milk fresh from the cows. The children's laughter gradually returned, cautious at first, then louder, more insistent. They spoke to each other in whispers and giggles, a language of survival that now included a taste of joy. I could hear it in the clatter of spoons against bowls, in the soft scuff of small feet against the wooden floor, and for a moment the weight of despair lifted, replaced by a fragile warmth. Yet even as the ranch became a sanctuary, the outside world loomed. I caught fragments of conversation carried by the wind from the distant town, words meant to sting, to shame, to remind me that I did not belong. The saloon, the market, the dusty streets, all alive with whispers. The widow and her brood, feeding on his generosity, shameless. I felt them as I carried water from the well, as I swept the floor, as I mended clothes. And I felt my cheeks burn with shame I did not deserve, a reminder that the world's cruelty was patient, persistent, and ever watchful. Richard seemed impervious. He moved among us with the same quiet precision, never responding to imagined slights, never justifying his choices. And in that silence, I found a strange strength. He was not loud, not grandiose, not heroic in the way stories of men saving women often claimed. He was simply steadfast, unyielding, refusing to let shame dictate our worth. Watching him, I realized that survival and dignity were sometimes quiet acts, woven into daily life with patience and resolve. The children learned, slowly, to trust again. The eldest boy began to take small responsibilities, helping feed the animals, tending to the garden we planted behind the house, or assisting me with chores. His hands, once too small and weak to hold a spoon with steadiness, now moved with care, learning the rhythm of tasks that promised growth rather than despair. The younger ones followed, mimicking the lessons, their small voices rising in song as they worked, filling the air with a fragile, tentative joy. And me. I found a rhythm too. Each day I rose, prepared the children, assisted with chores, and tended the small garden, all the while allowing myself to breathe in the steadiness of this place. My heart, once a battlefield of fear and exhaustion, began to rebuild itself piece by piece. I learned that dignity could return in small acts, the folding of laundry, the sweeping of floors, the coaxing of a seed into soil, the steady nourishment of my children's bodies and spirits. There were moments, though, when the memories of the plains pressed in, the rope cutting into my wrists, the hungry cries of my children, the leers of my in-laws. Those moments struck like lightning, brief and blinding, leaving my chest tight and my stomach hollow. But each time, Richard's presence offered a counterpoint, a quiet reassurance that the world did not have to be cruel, that we were no longer entirely at its mercy. By evening, the ranch settled into a gentle rhythm. Fires were stoked, cots arranged, and the children nestled together beneath patched quilts. I watched them, sitting quietly at the edge of their cots, hands folded, heart both weary and grateful. Richard lingered in the doorway, often silent, sometimes merely tilting his hat to hide the faintest curve of his mouth. I could not decipher what passed behind those eyes, only that they were steady, unflinching, as if measuring the weight of what had been entrusted to him. Outside, the wind carried the distant murmurs of the town, a persistent reminder that judgment awaited us beyond the fences. Yet inside, the rhythm of the ranch, the steady acts of care, and the small growth in my children's eyes formed a shield stronger than any words. Each day, we reclaimed a fragment of life that hunger and cruelty had stolen. Each day, dignity returned in the quiet acts of existence. And as night deepened, as the rain tapped softly against the roof, I understood that we were no longer merely surviving. We were beginning to live. Not in the grand gestures of stories, not in the applause of strangers, but in the quiet, patient reclamation of our bodies, our spirits, and our hope. For the first time since the plains had nearly broken us, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps we could endure, and that even in a world that had shown us only cruelty, kindness, patience, and steadfastness could take root and grow. The mornings had grown quieter at the ranch, the steady rhythm of work and survival settling into a fragile calm. Yet even here, in the sheltered folds of weathered wood and fenced pastures, the world beyond was never truly silent. The wind carried more than the scent of earth and rain. It carried the distant, cutting murmurs of a town that had long ago decided the measure of a woman by the weight of her shame. I first heard them one afternoon while tending the garden. The sun had dipped low, gilding the edges of the clouds with copper, and the children played at my feet, pressing seeds into the soft soil with small, determined hands. Their laughter, once cautious and intermittent, now rang freely through the air, a fragile bell of life. And then it came, a sound almost carried by the wind itself, a voice in the distance, harsh and mocking. My ears strained, and I recognized the cadence immediately, the kind of contempt that seeks to wound rather than inform. They say the widow Boone has shackled herself to that man, feeding her brood on his generosity. Shameless. The words struck like stones in my chest, each one a reminder of the world's cruelty, of the eyes that judged even from afar. I pressed my fingers into the earth, gripping it as if the soil could anchor me, could keep me from unraveling. The children sensed the tension, pausing in their play, eyes wide and questioning. I wanted to shield them, to whisper that none of it mattered here, in the safe folds of this ranch. But the world had a long reach, and even in its absence, its echoes could pierce the strongest walls. Richard noticed immediately. He did not speak, did not scold or argue. Instead, he moved with the quiet precision that had become his hallmark, drawing me aside as the children wandered to the edge of the garden. His gaze was steady, unyielding, and in it I felt the weight of protection, a promise carved in silence. Without words, he communicated a truth I had been too frightened to claim for myself, that outside whispers had no claim here, that the world's judgment could not dictate our worth, and that I was no longer merely a woman at the mercy of circumstance. That evening, as the children slept beneath patched quilts and the rain tapped softly against the roof, I sat at the hearth, hands busy with the remnants of the day's tasks. Richard lingered in the doorway, hat in hand, watching the firelight dance across my features. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was measured, deliberate, a silent lesson in patience and resilience. I realized then that survival was not only about feeding the body, but protecting the spirit, nurturing it against the corrosive whispers of shame. Over the next days, the whispers arrived in fragments, townsfolk on errands, distant conversations carried by the wind, even a fleeting glimpse of a stranger passing along the road who spat quietly in our direction. Each time, my first instinct was to recoil, to shrink into the corner of my own fear. Yet Richard's steady presence taught me otherwise. He did not fight the whispers with confrontation. Instead, he met them with quiet defiance, an unspoken declaration that our lives would not bend under rumor or scorn, that dignity was reclaimed through action, not approval. The children, sensing my fortitude in the wake of his example, began to mirror it. My eldest walked with a little more confidence, holding his head high even when the wind carried a distant jeer. The others followed suit, laughter returning to their lips even in the shadow of fear. And slowly, I too began to stand taller, chest rising with the small pride of those who had endured and survived. Each seed planted in the garden became more than a sprout. It became a symbol of growth, of life that refused to be smothered by neglect or judgment. Richard and I spent long hours in silence as the work of the ranch unfolded. He would check fences, tend animals, or repair equipment, while I moved alongside him, learning the rhythm of a life anchored in purpose and resilience. I watched his hands, calloused and strong, shaping tools, mending boards, lifting and placing with deliberate care. And in each of these acts I saw a lesson, that the measure of a life was not the approval of the world, but the steadiness of action in the face of it. There were moments, late at night, when I would pause by the doorway and see his silhouette against the fading stars. He never intruded, never imposed himself with words. yet his quiet watchfulness was a constant. In his presence, I learned that protection could be silent, that courage could be measured not by shouting but by the persistence of steady hands and unwavering eyes. And though the town's whispers continued to drift like smoke on the wind, I no longer felt the same helpless weight. I had begun to understand that survival was as much about reclaiming the heart as feeding the body. The children's laughter was a balm, the earth beneath our fingers a promise, and Richard's presence a quiet anchor against despair. By the time the sun set behind the hills, bathing the ranch in hues of crimson and gold, I felt a fragile but growing sense of belonging. We were no longer merely a widow and her children fleeing hunger and cruelty. We were a family bound not by law or custom, but by shared endurance, quiet courage, and the unspoken promise that we would protect each other against the world, no matter the cost. And in that stillness, as the fire burned low and the wind whispered through the cracks of the house, I allowed myself to believe, truly believe, that even in a world filled with cruelty and judgment, we could find strength, dignity, and a life worth living. The road ahead would not be free of hardship, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. It was early morning when I first noticed the wagon tracks in the dust beyond the fence. They were too deep, too deliberate to be the work of casual travelers. My heart tightened at the sight. Instinctively, I drew the children close, whispering for silence even though I did not know who, or what was coming. The wind carried the familiar scrape of wheels over hard earth, punctuated by muffled voices that I recognized all too well. My husband's kinfolk, and likely others from the town, had come. Richard appeared behind me, silent as a shadow, his presence grounding me even as fear clawed at my chest. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder, and though he said nothing, the steady pressure communicated a calm assurance. Whatever was coming, we would face it together. The children clung closer to me, sensing the tension in the air, their small bodies trembling. Hunger and terror had sharpened their instincts, and they seemed to understand that the world outside our fences had not forgotten us. The wagon came to a halt at the edge of the yard. The men dismounted, their faces twisted into expressions of greed and contempt. I could hear snippets of their muttered threats and accusations, words meant to wound and intimidate. "The widow Boone doesn't belong here," one said, his tone dripping with the certainty of judgment. "Blood is blood. She'll drag him down with her children." I wanted to shrink, to hide behind the children, to disappear into the small refuge we had carved out. But Richard's steady presence behind me reminded me that we were not helpless. He did not reach for his weapon, did not raise his voice, but there was a power in his silence that was almost tangible. It pressed into the men, into the dust, into the air itself, warning them that the sanctuary we had built would not be breached lightly. The eldest child stepped forward instinctively, a small gesture of defiance that made my chest tighten with both pride and worry. He had grown since we arrived at the ranch, learning the rhythms of work and survival, and in that brief movement, he reminded me that courage could be inherited, nurtured even in the smallest hearts. The younger ones huddled together, eyes wide, yet somehow trusting in the unspoken authority that Richard exuded. Words were exchanged, threats and accusations, each syllable a hammer striking at the walls of our fragile peace. Yet Richard remained still, his gaze unwavering. I could feel the weight of his presence like a shield, pressing outward, making it impossible for their venom to reach us fully. When the men finally spat onto the ground and turned to leave, muttering that we would regret this, I felt a surge of relief mixed with a new awareness. We had survived the first true test of our sanctuary. That night, the children slept closer than ever, and I sat by the fire, hands idle for the first time in weeks. The embers glowed faintly, casting shadows across the walls of the ranch, and I realized that survival was more than food and shelter. It was the ability to face the world without flinching, to claim the right to exist despite the cruelty that lurked beyond. Richard spoke little, but when he finally did, it was in the quiet, deliberate tone I had come to trust. "They are loud, but they have no power here," he said, and I understood the depth of his meaning. It was not just the physical presence of the ranch that offered protection. It was the strength of our unity, the refusal to bow to the judgment of others. In the days that followed, we returned to routine, yet something had shifted. The children moved with a little more confidence, their laughter less hesitant, their play less shadowed by fear. I noticed the small ways Richard guided us, adjusting chores to match our growing strength, teaching the children skills to care for the animals and the land, demonstrating patience that was both protective and empowering. Each day, the ranch became not just a shelter, but a place where dignity could be reclaimed, piece by piece. The gossip of the town persisted, like smoke carried on the wind, but it no longer reached me with the same power. I had begun to understand that the world could scorn, but it could not strip away the quiet victories we achieved each day. The warmth of a meal, the growth of a seedling, the laughter of children who had known only hunger and fear. And in this understanding, I felt the fragile stirrings of strength, a sense that we could endure, that we could exist and even flourish despite the world's attempts to deny us. Richard and I spent long hours in silence, sometimes working side by side, sometimes simply observing the children. Each act of care, each deliberate movement, was a lesson. Survival was as much about rebuilding the spirit as it was about filling the stomach. And though the shadow of judgment from the town lingered beyond our fences, it was no longer a threat strong enough to undo the fragile sanctuary we had created together. By the time evening fell, and the stars began to pierce the darkened sky, I realized something I had not dared to before. We were no longer merely fleeing from cruelty. We were claiming a space, asserting our right to exist, to love, to nurture, and to endure. And in that assertion, in the steady, quiet defiance that Richard embodied and that I had begun to embrace, I found the first true trace of freedom since the plains had nearly broken us. Days at the ranch had settled into a rhythm, a fragile but comforting cadence that carried us through mornings and nights alike. The children awoke to the smell of warm bread and stew, their small hands reaching instinctively for plates that had once been empty, their laughter filling the room with a sound I had not dared to hope for. Even the youngest began to recognize the steady predictability of care, smiling in the way a child does when fear and hunger are no longer constant companions. I moved among them with practiced gestures, brushing hair, tying laces, and coaxing reluctant bites into their mouths. Each motion carried weight beyond necessity. It was a reclaiming of dignity, both mine and theirs. I had learned to read the small cues of their growth, the way the eldest stood a little taller, the way their eyes sparkled when they discovered the smallest joys, the way my youngest finally relaxed into sleep without gripping my arm as if the night itself might devour him. Richard remained ever present, though always at a measured distance. His silence was deliberate, a constant reassurance that did not demand attention or gratitude. I watched him as he worked, repairing a fence, tending the animals, guiding a misbehaving colt back into line. Each motion was precise, deliberate, and quietly protective. There was an understated intimacy in the way he moved among us, a communication that needed no words. I felt the weight of his presence not as a burden, but as an anchor, steadying my own faltering courage. One afternoon, as I bent over the small garden, pressing seeds into rows of tilled soil, Richard approached without a word. He knelt beside me, his hands resting just inches from mine, calloused fingers brushing against the soft earth. I paused, startled by the nearness, and for a moment the air seemed to hold its breath. He said nothing, yet in that silence there was a message, that our lives, our survival, and our small victories here were recognized, respected, and safeguarded. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, fragile and unfamiliar, as if the steady presence of another could offer both protection and the possibility of trust. The children watched from the porch, curious and cautious, sensing the subtle shift in the air. They had begun to learn that safety was more than the absence of hunger. It was the reassurance that our hearts could beat in rhythm with another's without fear, that we could rely upon hands that did not inflict harm, that eyes could watch without judgment. Each day, their trust in Richard grew, mirrored in my own tentative acceptance of his quiet guardianship. Evenings were the most intimate moments. After the chores were done, after the animals were fed and the garden tended, we would gather by the hearth. The children slept beneath quilts patched with love, and I often found myself alone with Richard, sharing the space without words. His gaze, steady and unflinching, seemed to probe not for secrets but for understanding, measuring the strength that had carried me from despair to this fragile sanctuary. On one such night I felt the weight of my past, the rope cutting into my wrists, the starving cries of my children, the scornful eyes of my in-laws, and yet I did not shrink. Instead, I pressed my hands into my lap and allowed myself to acknowledge the small victories, the warmth of the fire, the comfort of the children sleeping nearby, the steadiness of a man who had chosen to defy the world for our sake. I realized then that pride was not restored in a single act, but in the slow accumulation of quiet moments where courage and resilience were exercised day after day. Richard watched me then, from the doorway, his silhouette framed by lamplight and the faint glow of embers. He said nothing, but I sensed a shift, a recognition, not of my past shame, but of the dignity I had reclaimed through survival and perseverance. There was no grand declaration, no romantic flourish. Instead, there was understanding, and in that understanding lay something more powerful than words, a bond formed in shared endurance and mutual respect, one that had taken root quietly, resiliently, without demand or pretense. The days passed in this measured rhythm, each one a testament to survival and subtle healing. The children thrived in small ways. The eldest helped with chores and learning. The younger ones explored the pasture, discovering life beyond fear. I learned to walk a little taller, to speak a little louder, to allow the smallest sparks of joy to reach my heart without guilt. And Richard remained a constant, silent and steady, guiding without imposing, protecting without control. In those quiet bonds, I began to understand the shape of love, not the grand gestures of storybooks, but the persistent, patient attention that nurtured life, restored dignity, and quietly defied a cruel world. And though the town's whispers still drifted on the wind, carried from distant streets and curious voices, I felt, for the first time, that they held no power here. Within the walls of the ranch, amidst the warmth of fire and food, and in the watchful steadiness of a man who had chosen to protect us, I had begun to reclaim not only my life but my heart. The day began like any other at the ranch, with a soft glow of sunrise spilling across the weathered boards and the children stretching beneath quilts that smelled faintly of the earth. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of tilled soil and livestock, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that the world's cruelty had been left behind, outside the fences and pastures that marked our sanctuary. But the world has a persistence that cannot be tamed by fences alone. By mid-morning I saw the telltale signs, dust rising on the horizon, wagon wheels cutting deep furrows into the dry earth, the unmistakable clatter of hooves approaching. My chest tightened, a familiar tension coiling within me. I drew the children close, whispering for silence even as my own voice trembled. They sensed the danger, clinging to me with a mix of fear and hope, eyes wide. Richard appeared without a word, shadowed by the early sunlight as he emerged from the barn. His presence, steady and unwavering, offered a reassurance that the wind and dust could not carry. I felt the weight of his hand on my shoulder, and the knowledge that whatever was coming, we would face it together. The wagon arrived at the edge of the yard, dust swirling around its wheels. Men dismounted, faces hard with greed and malice, their eyes gleaming with the certainty of entitlement. Among them were figures I recognized from the town, the same men who had whispered and laughed, their contempt a constant shadow. Now they stood before us, closer than ever, their intent unmistakable. They say the widow Boone has bound herself to this man. One spat, voice low and venomous. A brood of mouths, feeding off his generosity. He'll ruin himself with them. I wanted to shrink, to press myself into the corner of the house and shield my children, to vanish into the small sanctuary we had built. But Richard's presence grounded me, his quiet authority a shield more powerful than any weapon. He did not raise his voice, did not reach for his revolver, yet the air seemed to shift, bending under the weight of his gaze. The men faltered, sensing the steadfastness that was not born of threat, but of resolve. I noticed the subtle courage in my eldest child as he stepped forward, small hands clenched, shoulders squared. The younger ones pressed close, trusting instinctively in the safety that Richard's presence provided. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the rhythm of life that had been nearly broken return in quiet, steady pulses. Survival was no longer just about nourishment. It was about asserting the right to exist, to be seen without shame. Richard did not speak immediately. He observed, measured, allowing the men to feel the weight of their own judgments before responding. And when he finally did, it was in a calm, deliberate tone, each word carrying authority without arrogance. "They are home here. You may turn back, or stay and witness the cost of your choices." The threat hung in the air like storm clouds over the plains. The men exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across faces hardened by cruelty. One drew a knife, but Richard's hand moved slowly, deliberately toward the revolver at his hip. Not a single word was raised, but the tension tightened like a drawn wire, vibrating in the air around us. For a heartbeat, the world seemed poised on the edge of violence. Then, with a collective hiss of frustration, the men withdrew, spitting on the ground as they returned to their wagons. Their departure left dust in the air and silence in their wake, yet the shadow of menace lingered, a reminder that the world beyond our fences had not yet surrendered its cruelty. Inside the ranch, we huddled together briefly, relief and fear mingling in the small space between us. The children's laughter returned slowly, tentative at first, then growing, as if reclaiming the sounds of joy had become an act of defiance. I felt my own shoulders relax, though the tension did not entirely fade. It was a reminder that our peace was precious and fragile, worth guarding fiercely. The evening settled in with the soft glow of lamplight and the steady warmth of the hearth. Richard and I moved about the house in quiet cooperation, tending to chores, feeding the children, and ensuring the animals were secure. Words were sparse, yet each glance, each careful movement, spoke volumes. He guided without controlling, protected without imposing, and in every action, he demonstrated the power of quiet defiance and steadfast care. That night, as I watched the children sleep, I realized that survival had transformed. It was no longer merely about food or shelter. It was about courage, dignity, and the strength to claim a life in defiance of judgment. The storm outside the fences had tested us, and we had endured, not through grand gestures, but through presence, patience, and unwavering resolve. And as the wind whispered against the walls of the ranch, I understood that we had begun to forge something more than mere survival. We were creating a sanctuary where fear could not dominate, where love and resilience could grow quietly, and where even in the shadow of the world's cruelty, we could stand unbowed together. The sun rose softly over the horizon, spilling amber light across the rolling fields of the ranch, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the stillness of morning not as a weight but as a promise. The children stirred beneath the quilts, their small limbs stretching lazily, eyes blinking at the first gentle rays. I moved among them, brushing hair, straightening collars, and feeling a profound gratitude for the life we were slowly reclaiming. Hunger no longer dictated the rhythm of our days, and fear had begun to loosen its grip on small shoulders. Richard moved beside me in silence, a shadow in the light, attending to the animals and the day's tasks with a calm precision that both grounded and inspired me. He never demanded attention, never sought recognition, but in the quiet gestures, the way he corrected the calf without startling it, the measured way he lifted a heavy sack of feed, the soft glance cast toward the children. He communicated more than words ever could, that we were safe, valued, and capable of growth. I began to notice the subtleties of his care in ways I had not before. A loaf of bread, placed closer to the eldest child without fanfare, a hand resting briefly on my shoulder as I swept the floor, a tilt of the head that suggested patience rather than judgment. It was in these moments, simple and unspoken, that I realized the depth of trust forming between us. Our bond was not forged in passion or grand declarations, but in steady presence, quiet attentiveness, and shared endurance. The children thrived in this environment of steady predictability. The eldest helped me with chores, his movements deliberate and careful, carrying water, tending animals, and checking the garden. The younger ones explored the pasture, learning the rhythms of life outside the four walls of our home. Each day they gained not only strength and skill, but confidence, a sense that their existence mattered, that they were capable of shaping their own world. And in their growth, I found courage for myself, a renewal of spirit that allowed me to meet each morning without fear. Richard and I spent our evenings in a quiet companionship, our conversations few but meaningful. Sometimes we worked side by side, mending tools or repairing fences, sharing silence as though it were a language of its own. Other times, we simply observed the children, allowing laughter and play to fill the room. I learned to read the subtleties in his expression, the slight relaxation of his jaw, the brief softening of his gaze, as indicators of approval, reassurance, and understanding. In this shared observation, a fragile intimacy emerged, one that spoke of respect, trust, and mutual endurance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I found myself alone in the garden, pressing seeds into the soil while Richard lingered nearby, leaning against the fence. The children played just beyond, their laughter a gentle echo across the fields. He did not speak, and yet I felt the weight of his attention, steady and unintrusive. The silence was comfortable, almost sacred, a quiet acknowledgement of the lives we had rebuilt together. I realized then that dignity and love were often found in these unspoken gestures, the steady hand, the shared glance, the willingness to remain present when the world outside sought to undermine us. We were learning that trust is not demanded, but cultivated, and that true courage lies in the quiet constancy of presence rather than the spectacle of heroism. The wind carried distant whispers from the town, faint but persistent, reminders that the world beyond our fences had not forgotten us. Yet within the ranch, the impact of their judgment was diminished. We had grown stronger, individually and together, finding in each other a refuge that no outside scorn could dismantle. The children's laughter, the warmth of shared meals, and the rhythm of daily work became acts of defiance against a world that sought to measure worth by cruelty and gossip. That night, as the fire crackled and the children slept beneath quilts patched with love and care, I sat quietly, reflecting on the growth that had taken root in all of us. Richard's presence, patient and steady, had given us more than safety. It had restored a sense of purpose, a reclamation of pride, and a slow but certain renewal of hope. In the quiet of that evening, I understood that the bonds we had forged were not fleeting. They were rooted deeply in the soil of shared endurance, respect, and the courage to exist with dignity. And as I watched him rise and move to check the animals one last time before retiring for the night, I felt a warmth that went beyond safety or provision. It was the knowledge that we had become more than survivors. We were a family, bound not by circumstance or obligation, but by trust, love, and a quiet defiance that had allowed us to reclaim our lives from the world's cruelty. In that moment, I allowed myself to hope, not for grandeur, not for approval, but for a future built on steadfast presence, mutual care, and the unwavering strength of hearts that had refused to break. The morning sun barely broke through the clouds when I saw them approaching again, a small but determined group from the town. My stomach tightened, not from hunger this time, but from a familiar knot of dread. The children sensed it, pausing in their play, their small eyes flicking toward the fence where the figures had appeared. Richard stood beside me, calm and unshaken, a presence that carried more weight than the men at the gate. I felt my pulse slow slightly in his steadiness, though my heart still carried the remnants of fear. These men had come with purpose, their faces etched with contempt, voices ready to scold and intimidate. "They don't belong here," one shouted, the accusation carried across the yard. "He'll ruin himself feeding that brood of mouths." Richard didn't answer. His silence was deliberate, a firm wall against their words. I could see the shift in the men, hesitation in the confidence they had carried the last time. The eldest child stood a little taller, the younger ones clutching each other in quiet solidarity. I realized that our defiance was no longer dependent on words. Our presence, unbowed, unbroken, was proof enough. Slowly, as the dust settled and the men assessed the unyielding calm, they muttered threats and turned away, leaving our ranch untouched. In that moment, I felt something bloom inside me, not just relief, but pride. We had endured another test, and each act of courage, each moment of steadfastness, had strengthened the invisible bond that held our little family together. Richard's hand brushed mine briefly as he guided me back inside, a silent acknowledgement of survival and quiet victory. The children returned to their laughter, and I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in days. The storm outside our gate had passed, but its lesson remained. Dignity and strength were cultivated not in defiance of fear, but in the steady, unyielding choice to protect what we held dear. The morning air was crisp and golden, spilling light across the fields as if blessing the land that had become our sanctuary. The children awoke with laughter, the sound a melody of resilience that had grown stronger with every passing day. I watched them from the porch, feeling an unfamiliar warmth bloom within me, a warmth born not from the sun, but from the life we had carved together. Richard stood nearby, hat tilted against the light, watching the children with a quiet intensity that had always unsettled and comforted me in equal measure. His presence was steady, unspoken reassurance that the past's cruelty had no hold here. No more whispers, no more threats could touch what we had forged through patience, endurance, and care. That day, we prepared for a small ceremony at the ranch. There would be no grand church or curious eyes from townfolk, only the 4 children, the gentle sway of fields in the wind, and 2 hearts who had endured the worst the world could offer. I donned a simple dress, mended with careful stitches and love, and felt for the first time that I was stepping not as a widow, nor as a woman defined by hunger or shame, but as a person fully alive, fully seen, and fully deserving of hope. Richard guided us through the ritual, his voice steady and solemn, but never overbearing. Each vow was spoken quietly, deliberately, an affirmation of survival, loyalty, and love without pretense. The children's hands were clasped in ours, their small eyes shining with pride and joy. I felt the weight of the past, the rope, the hunger, the cruel scorn, dissolve beneath the certainty of what we now possessed, a family forged in endurance, bound not by circumstance, but by choice. As the sun dipped lower, bathing the ranch in rose and gold, I realized that the world outside could whisper, judge, or sneer all it wanted. Its cruelty had been rendered powerless by our quiet acts of defiance, our steady presence, our nurturing of life, our unshakable care for one another. Richard's hand rested lightly on mine, not demanding affection, not seeking applause, but offering a silent promise that whatever storms lay ahead, we would face them together. The children laughed freely, chasing one another through the fields, their joy unshadowed by fear. I watched them, feeling a sense of completion I had not thought possible, a dignity restored not through wealth or grandeur, but through survival, courage, and the unwavering choice to love in a world that often refused it. That evening, as the fire flickered low and the wind whispered across the plains, I allowed myself to feel the fullness of our triumph. We had endured hunger, cruelty, and the judgment of an unforgiving world. We had survived not through grand gestures, but through quiet constancy, steadfast care, and the strength of hearts unwilling to break. Richard's eyes met mine, and in their steady gaze, I saw not just protection, but partnership, respect, and a love unspoken yet deeply understood. I knew, finally, that dignity was never gifted by the world. It was reclaimed in the courage to stand, to endure, and to nurture what is precious against all odds. And in that moment, I understood that we were no longer defined by the past, by hunger, by shame, or by scorn. We were defined by the life we had chosen, the bonds we had nurtured, and the sanctuary we had built together. The West could judge, could whisper, could attempt to intimidate. But here, on this land, with the children laughing and the fire warming our hearts, we had triumphed. We had found love, dignity, and the unshakable power of a family bound not by circumstance, but by choice.